Hi, George. So great to be here with you.
Likewise, Scott. Great to see you.
So, as we start talking about Martech for 2024, I want to start with the big white whale of marketing, the dream of one-to-one personalization. Boy, we've been looking for that for decades. What stands between us and bringing that dream to life in this age of generative AI?
Yeah, because when I chat with people about this, everyone describes it in the same terms. So this idea of the perfect message at the perfect time, through the right channel, for each individual, based on everything you know about them. It's almost a cliche, right? That kind of combination of things, given how much we hear it. And I've been thinking about it, and I really see three bottlenecks. I've come to think about it in terms of bottlenecks. What are these specific challenges that marketers have in getting there? Because pretty much every single marketer agrees that's the dream, that's the promised land, but almost nobody is actually there. And I think there's three things. The first is data integration. So, in order to be able to do the perfect thing for each person through the right channel at the right time, you need to get all your systems talking to each other. And that's challenging because all these systems interpret data and produce data in different formats. And so, how do you get that data transferred and translated? It's a bit of a Tower of Babel situation in the Martech stack. So, that's the data bottleneck, or the data integration bottleneck is the first one. The second bottleneck is content creation. In order to be sending the perfect message to each person, you actually need a large library of potential messages. And writing content is very labor intensive. Because it's not just authoring, right? It's then actually, it's creating the assets. It's the writing, it's the images, it's the compiling it all, it's running it by various departments that need to approve. So that's the content bottleneck. And then the third bottleneck is the experimentation bottleneck. Even if you have all of your systems beautifully talking to each other and all the data is wonderful and you have this magnificent library of content, how do you then know what is actually the best thing to be sending to each person? And today, the way marketers do that is a lot of manual experimentation in the form of A/B tests. That's incredibly labor intensive because you need to design the experiments, you need to then run it, you need to analyze the results. Every time something changes, like customer behaviors perhaps shift, you need to redo it, or if you have a new idea or a new asset. And so, very quickly, it just doesn't scale. You can maybe test a few things for your most important campaigns, but truly testing at segment, micro segment level, not even talking about one-to-one, just is impossible in that frame. So those to me are the three bottlenecks that today prevent marketers from reaching that dream.
I'm going to have to remember the phrase Martech Tower of Babel. That's a memorable. All right, let's actually start there to just dig in a little bit deeper on the data bottleneck. This seems like an area where there's a lot of discussion around the cloud data warehouse. What are you seeing as far as like where marketers are at like right now in this journey of trying to get past the data bottleneck?
Yeah, I think the last 5 to 10 years have actually seen huge progress there. So 10 years ago, I think few marketers at enterprises even had a unified view of the customer. They'd have data living in 17 different systems of record, all with different customer IDs. And so getting that 360 was just impossible. And I think it's clearly been a huge priority at enterprises to unify data and do identity resolution, to where now, for example, with first party data, it's all being brought into warehouses or customer data platforms. And it's a big effort, right? It's many years to do this, but enterprises have really made it a priority, to where today, for any enterprise to not have unified its data somewhere, at least to some extent, is more the exception. Those folks are typically on the lagging side, and they know, so they're making that a priority. And I'll be surprised if 5 years from now it's almost unheard of.
And so, how is generative AI helping with that?
Yeah, I think it's going to. I think what's going to happen with generative AI, marketers talk a lot about how generative AI is going to help write content, which is true. That's the obvious application we've all played with ChatGPT. I think the less obvious thing is it's actually very good at interpreting data and then writing configuration. So we also know about how it codes. It codes reasonably well. I wouldn't necessarily take its code and put it into production. But when you have a more defined situation, like, for example, transforming data from one format into another, it's a more closed-ended problem. And then you don't need these models to be writing arbitrary Python code. It's enough to give them certain configuration formats and have them write in those formats, which are easier to validate. And that's completely solvable even with the models as they are today. So what we're going to see is, I'm sure there will be standalone companies that do this, but also existing companies will do this, is use these language models to make data transformation much easier and totally automated. So anytime you need data from one format ported into a different format, whereas today you need data engineers writing a bunch of custom SQL queries or whatever, instead what you're going to have is the ability to use language models to interpret the data, maybe ask a few clarifying questions about it, the user answers those questions, and then those models automatically create all the configuration needed to automatically take that data, transform it, and get those systems talking to each other. So it's like giving a personalized automated translator to each citizen of this Tower of Babel in the Martech stack, which will make it much easier for everyone to communicate with everyone else.
I love
That's
it.
going to take time. That's going to take time because that's not as easy to build as adding a subject line generator widget into an existing tool. But I think, for example, at OfferFit, we're already working on this and building into a version of our system that we're going to release in 2024. And I'll be surprised if other tech companies aren't starting to work on that as well. And so over the next 5 years, I think we're going to start to see that gradually come into the market.
Super cool. All right. I love this 3 bottlenecks view. So that's the data layer. The content side, as you said, it's probably the most obvious case right now with generative AI, how it's being used to help generate content. Just as a little bit more of a specific question around that, is it matter of the form in which that content is? Like, how do we make sure that content's actually usable in a one-to-one personalization scenario?
Yeah. I think there are some of the obvious and then some less obvious things. The obvious things are things like making sure that there's a way to include your brand guidelines so that the content that's produced is on brand, making sure that the interfaces really support the interaction between the marketer and the large language models. So it's not large language models just like writing it and then putting it into production. There needs to be a feedback loop both ways, where the language models make suggestions, the marketer gives feedback on maybe what they got wrong, then that's incorporated in subsequent iterations. That's really needed to make this actually convenient for marketers, as opposed to sounds cool, but not really practically helpful. So that to me is the stuff that's maybe not as surprising, but I think will need to be thoughtfully productized by any companies that build this capability into their tools. And of course, carefully considered by marketers who are looking at these tools. Then I think there's less obvious stuff, like for example, and this may sound a bit more technical, but I think it's important, it's parameterization. So if you create this content library, and then you're going to be feeding this into some kind of automated experimentation tools, it's less efficient if the tool sees this as a big soup, like a big grab bag of content, and it all looks the same. Because then, just from a statistical point of view, running those tests and finding out what works and what doesn't work is much harder, because you're testing these 5,000 discrete things. What you want in order for it to then be good for experimentation is you need there to be some structure. So it's more like a lasagna than a soup. And so, for example, you have these pieces of content, you actually need to know, oh, these two are actually the same, except there's a different subject line. It's the same email, but with a different subject line. Or these are the same ad, but they have a different background color, or whatever you're changing. And so that's why, to me, actually, there does need to be, for best results, a linkage between where you're generating at least variants of content and then where you're testing those content. That needs to happen within a single tool. So my guess is, in the tech stack of the future, fast forward 5 to 10 years, there will be some tools where you use generative AI to create completely new assets, like a brand new email or a brand new ad. But then to create different variants of that asset and test them, that's going to be a different system where those two things are under the same roof, because that's how you can make sure that the experimentation is structured correctly to make sure that it's efficient.
All right, this definitely then leads into the third bottleneck that is clearly opening up wider and wider around experimentation. How do you see generative AI changing, I would say, this art and science of experimentation? What's your view?
Yeah. So there's a branch of machine learning called reinforcement learning. And it crops up different places. Like, folks might have heard a few years ago when DeepMind, which is now owned by Google, built this model that taught itself to play chess. No one told it how to play chess. It played against itself 4 million times and became better than the world's best players and any other software system ever built before. And it was using reinforcement learning. It's this type of machine learning where this model teaches itself through trying different things and learning from the results. So in reinforcement learning, you're not just looking at historical data and learning from that. you're actually learning through trial and error, just like experimentation. So in fact, it is just a generalization of experimentation to this more complicated situations. And reinforcement learning actually is also, some folks have heard of it in reference to generative AI, because these language models, you might have heard of reinforcement learning through human feedback. So it gets applied to send these models to finishing schools to teach them not to say profane things. But it's a core part of the modern AI toolkit. And it's obviously extremely relevant for marketing, because marketers today do a ton of these manual experiments. And every marketer I talk to, if they're not doing A/B testing, it's because they just don't have the resources to do that experimentation, and they realize it's a big gap and it's like a main pain for them. If they are doing experimentation and A/B testing, it's also a big pain for them because they've seen the power of it, but they want to go faster. And they realize that they're going at 1% of the speed they'd like to be going in order to capture the full value that there is in being empirical about your marketing and trying different things. And so I think there's this huge opportunity, and that's of course what OfferFit works on, is how do you give marketers those tools to where they can ditch manual A/B testing, set up reinforcement learning to automatically experiment and improve all of their campaigns. I think until recently, it wasn't even practical because the data infrastructure wasn't there in companies and the machine learning wasn't yet mature enough. So you need both sufficiently mature understanding of how to set up these models correctly, as well as enterprises just need to have unified data and modern systems in place. And I think in the last few years, those two things have come together. And so now the opportunity is there. And so now I think we're going to see marketers start to get access to those tools like OfferFit that help them make that switch from A/B testing to automated experimentation.
So huge technological revolution here. What about how much of a cultural mindset shift needs to happen in organizations to really be able to take advantage of this?
I think it's going to be significant. I think it'll vary. It varies from company to company and from campaign to campaign. But I think the first thing is just moving to an experimentation mindset to begin with. I actually think that's easier than maybe it sounds. I think 10 years ago, there was a big debate at companies of, oh, do you A/B test? Do you even do experimentation? From what I'm seeing, that debate's been largely settled. There's no longer this division or this acrimony between quantitative marketers or performance marketers and brand marketers, as far as I can tell. I think there's now this much more nuanced understanding that to be an excellent marketer or an excellent marketing department, you need both capabilities, because not everything is measurable, at least in an easy way. So you need the more strategic brand perspective. At the same time, a lot of things are measurable. And if you're not being rigorous and quantitative, you're leaving value on the table there. So in terms of the cultural shift, maybe to start with, the cultural shift that I think probably doesn't need to happen as much is just understanding the importance of experimentation. I think that's pretty embedded now among marketers. I think the cultural shift that will need to happen is a bit of at a lot of companies, is a shift from an ad hoc calendared approach to marketing to a much more programmatic approach. So today, a lot of marketing departments live and die by the calendar. And they say, hey, let's make new content. And every single week, they're producing net new content. And that actually makes it really hard to be running any kind of meaningful experimentation program, because you're starting from scratch, as opposed to having certain assets that you're constantly improving and tinkering with and testing and learning about. So the cultural shift that I think that's going to need to happen is, at least for some campaigns, obviously some things are indeed calendared announcements of some new product that shipped or something like this. But for pretty much everything else, it's moving away from this calendar-based approach and much more having some kind of library of content and then running experiments to personalize and optimize that over time, because that really allows you to keep constantly getting better instead of starting back at square one every week.
Very cool. All right, I want to come back to where we started on the data layer here. It's incredible that, yeah, more and more of this data is becoming available through cloud data warehouses or customer data platforms or things like that. But particularly when we think about it with the cloud data warehouse, the greatest advantage is, oh, all this data from all across the company that we have the option of leveraging in our marketing and our experimentation. What's the flip side of that? What are some of the challenges that marketers have to be prepared to overcome in that open cloud data warehouse environment?
Yeah. I think the first thing is, it is a lot of work to actually properly unify the data. So we see it all the time where companies, even if after they've done efforts to reconcile it, you still have records where you look at one table and it looks like it's two different customers, but actually they're the same person. And that's how it is in a different table. And that can create a lot of issues. So there's this blocking and tackling. Another thing that we see is just data strategy. So trying to think, what are the things that companies should be calculating themselves versus things that should be calculated by partners? Like this comes up with OfferFit. And even within the company, what are the things that should be calculated in this part of the data ecosystem versus another part, and making sure that you have some consistent way of doing that. So basically, I think we're seeing companies make a lot of progress here, but it sounds very easy to say, oh yeah, unify your data, resolve identities. But in practice, I think it takes significant work. And then the next challenge is, let's say you've done that. I think what we found is companies have often made multi-million-dollar investments in getting this data unified. And there was an underlying assumption that once that data was unified, that then it would just naturally follow that you're now using that data to make personalized decisions for each person. And that's going to generate business value. And I think there's a missing step there that frankly, I think a lot of companies missed. And it's a little bit like the South Park episode. I don't know if you know this episode about the underwear gnomes.
I know where you're going, yes.
Yeah, the underwear gnomes. So so for those listening from home, these were these gnomes that would go out and collect underwear. They'd steal people's underwear. And then they had a grand plan. And step 1 was collect underwear. Step 2 was a question mark. And step 3 was profit. And they were still working on step 2. And so I think there's a little bit of this where step 1, unify data. Great. Step 3 is profit. But then the step 2 is a big challenge. And I think that relates to the experimentation bottleneck, right? It's because just because you know everything about folks, that doesn't tell you what is the optimal action to take. And it can even help you. Let's say you have a data science team, your data scientists can come in and they can build predictive models. But these models are usually saying things like, this person's more likely to churn or less likely to churn, or this person has a preference for this category of goods or that category of goods. That's still not a recommendation. That's still not telling you what's best to do. And so today, what a lot of companies are doing, even extremely sophisticated companies, is they have all these predictive models, but then they feed them into these somewhat arbitrary rules. For example, if you have a high propensity to purchase a certain category, then communicate to that person about that category. And that doesn't always work. For example, I have a very high propensity to purchase diapers because I have a 2-year-old son, but it doesn't mean you should email me about diapers. I don't need to be reminded to buy diapers in marketing communications. I'm not going to forget that. And so I think it's a goofy example, but it illustrates the point that the marketing communications that create impact don't necessarily map in a neat way to predictive models of what someone will do generically left to their own. And so today there's this beautiful unified data. In some cases, companies have even then supplemented them with really rich predictive machine learning models. But then there's still this big gap, which today is filled by these arbitrary tangle of rules saying, in this case, do this thing, in that case, do that thing. And the only way to perfect those rules is through A/B testing, which we already talked about how difficult and impractical that is. So to me, that final block that companies are going to need to put in is machine learning driven automated experimentation. So you need to, instead of having these arbitrary rules, you need to actually be using reinforcement learning or equivalent in order to be experimentally discovering what are the actions that you need to take that are going to maximize your performance, as opposed to making assumptions about that based on predictive models.
Yeah, no, it's the only way to deal with the scale of that. All right, so one last question I want to ask, because you and I had chatted a bit about this before. The evolution that you're seeing in the relationship between marketing and finance, and how this sort of growing wave of reinforcement learning, experimentation, perhaps is a path for a better world between marketing and finance.
Yeah, we've seen this. Obviously, interest rates have gone up quite a bit. The implication that this has is basically, from a CFO's perspective, it means that future cash flows are now worth less than they were worth before. So in a case when you have low interest rates, like almost zero interest rates, $1 today and $1 in 5 years to a CFO is worth the same, because you can invest that dollar for 5 years, it'll still be $1 because interest rates are zero. If interest rates are 5%, if you have $1 today, even if you invest it at zero risk, it's going to grow 5% a year for 5 years, and it's going to be worth a lot more in 5 years. So that's causing these finance departments to tighten their policies on what sorts of projects and investments qualify to be financially valuable for the company. it basically raises the bar. Anytime you're investing in order to make money later, that bar is now higher. And one immediate way that's hit marketing is acquisition marketing. So before, in zero interest rate environment, spend all you can on acquisition. And even if those customers only return that money over the long term in the form of that customer lifetime value over many years, that's fine. It's zero interest rates. So that's grow at all costs. Now that's no longer the case. And so CFOs have really been tightening that, and companies have been restricting acquisition budgets and raising the bar on what qualifies. But they still need to grow quickly. There's still a huge burden for these companies to hit their growth targets. And so what we've seen is a shift of focus from acquisition marketing to an increased focus on customer marketing, aka lifecycle marketing, of what can you do through, in many cases, owned free channels like SMS, email, push notification, in-app to your existing customer base in order to maximize both the value that you as a company are providing to your customers so that they stay with you longer and they're happy customers who then tell their friends and drive organic growth, and also maximize the value by selling things most effectively to them so that you're offering the goods and services that they want to buy and maximizing the value for the customer and for the company of that existing customer base. So we're seeing much more so that this is higher on the agenda of CMOs, where in the zero interest rate environment, they were much more focused on acquisition, just new people in the door. And now there's much more of a focus. How can we optimize these campaigns that we're running to our existing customer base? How can we improve our experimentation practices for CRM lifecycle marketing?
Awesome. George, I could stay here and pick your brain for another 3 hours. We are out of time, but thank you so much. I really appreciate your, just insight into how this is evolving, and wishing you the very best on your adventures for 2024 ahead.
Of course. Thanks, Scott. Always a pleasure chatting with you.